If you keep waiting until you're ready to read, speak, listen, write in the languages that you're learning, you will never feel ready. Perfectionism is keeping you stuck in all areas of your language studies, but today I'm going to show you exactly how to break free from that for real this time. Let's jump into it. When it comes to being a perfectionist, as your resident introvert and perfectionist language coach, it can be a challenge. Deal with trying to make things perfect in your language studies, right? But how does this show up in our language studies in the first place? What does it look like? For example, this can look like trying to sound like a native speaker. Maybe this is something that you really wanted for yourself in your language studies, and you've looked it up. You've looked up all the resources on how to sound more like a native speaker. I can't tell you the number of times that I've been asked this, or I've seen this question out on the internet. Let me tell you, it is way more important to be understood than it is to sound like a native speaker. Because I think also, if you define, like, what does it mean to sound like a native speaker to you, right? What does that actually mean? Most people, when they say that, they mean C2. Now, if you're not familiar with the leveling of languages, generally a lot of people will use A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, C2. A's are the beginners, B's are the intermediate, C's are the advanced, and C2 is their native level. But the reality is that many native speakers of whatever language, are not at C2 level, but they're more like B1, B2. And so you're striving for something that's not the norm, even by the native speakers of the languages that you're learning. So why do you want that? And if that is the norm, if C1, C2 is the norm, why do you want to reach that level? What is it going to allow you to do? What is it going to enable you to do in your life? Are there specific topics that you want to explore, conversation or in media that you'll only be able to understand at that native level? Sometimes perfection also shows up in us trying to have flawless grammar. And sometimes it's when we're feeling really guilty for any mistake that we make, literally any mistake at all. And then the biggest one that I see both in my own life and in many of the perfectionists that I work with is setting not just high expectations, but high and unrealistic expectations. That's the caveat. That's the extra bit we got to pay attention to, because it's okay to have high expectations, but what's not okay is having high expectations that are also unrealistic, because it's not taking into account our lives, our lived experiences. And then ultimately, all of these things that we want perfection out of means that we end up just sitting and waiting until we feel ready. It's almost like waiting for fluency to just drop into your lap and then suddenly you're fluent. But that's not how it works. It takes time, it takes effort, it takes practice, it takes energy. We're waiting until some magic wand waves away mistakes and then we suddenly make 0 mistakes ever in our language studies. That's impossible. We're always making mistakes in our native languages and in the languages that we're learning. So the reality is we make mistakes all the time. And here's what I want you to do about it. I want you to adjust your expectations. Now, I talk a lot about levels of expectations, and the general idea of it is 3 levels: good, better, best. Good is your low expectation, not necessarily that you wouldn't want for yourself, but it's your bare minimum. If I do this, then I know I'm still going to be making progress. I talk a little bit more about it in this video here, so make sure to watch that if you want the full overview of levels of expectation. But essentially, setting those levels of expectations means that our high overachieving expectation is now level 3, is our best, and not level 1, our bare minimum. And once you set that, when you have more time and energy, you get to do more. You give yourself permission to do more, but that's not your everyday expectation when you're low on energy and time. So here's the second thing when it comes to perfectionism and how it's impacting our language studies. As perfectionists, we need to come to terms with the fact that mistakes are part of the learning process. We make mistakes all the time, as I always say, in our native languages, in the languages that we're learning. It's just how we learn. We make a mistake, we learn what to do, we learn what not to do. And the one thing I say over and over again inside of Fluency Mastery Lab is it's not about avoiding the mistakes and avoiding the failure, but it's about what you do when you make the mistake. When the mistake happens, what are you going to do about it? I talk about this so much that I actually made this post where I said, what are you going to do? Are you going to crash out? Are you going to feel guilty and hate yourself and give up entirely? Or are you going to acknowledge that you made a mistake and learn from it? Are you going to get support with the mistake that you've made? Are you going to move forward and make more progress? What are you going to do when you make the mistake? So if you've never thought about that before, think about it now. What are you going to do when you make that mistake? And this is coming from someone, not just me talking about my perfectionism, but also I did extensive research on failure and why we are so afraid of failure. My entire presentation for my grad studies was on the fear of failure. This is someone who thinks about this all the time. And so the reality is, if you're avoiding making mistakes, then you're avoiding making progress. And what I want you to do instead is create what I'm going to call a mistake action plan. What will you do when you make mistakes plan, so that you're not getting stuck on what do I do next? I made a mistake. Let me focus on avoiding the mistakes that are going to happen. And instead you focus on making progress. Now, the third thing that happens when we are so focused on perfection in our language studies is that if we're striving for perfection, we will never feel ready. Waiting to feel ready means that you're going to wait longer to start. And if you wait longer to start, you're going to reach those goals, realize that vision, start using the languages that you're learning much later than you would like to. The longer it takes you to get started, the longer it's going to take you to make that progress and use what you're learning. That's the reality. And no, it is not your age nor your skill that impacts any of these things. The amount of times that I hear people saying, I'm in my 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and I am not as good at this as I used to be. No, you're using the same strategies that you tried to use 20 years ago and they don't work for you anymore. So you've assumed that you're just not good at this anymore rather than adjusting what works for you. That's part of what I do when I am in my coaching sessions with members. How can we adjust? What worked for you then? Does that still work for you? Why or why not? Let's figure it out. Let's work through it together. So one of the quotes that I share a lot everywhere, not mine, but whether you think you can or think you can't, you are right. The idea behind that quote is that when you believe that you can't do this, you can't learn languages, you definitely can't learn multiple languages, you can't go on this journey, then not only are you going to reinforce it by doing things that prove to you that you can't do it, you are going to only notice the moments when you can't do it. If you have a study session, but you're already dreading that resource or that strategy, you're going to skip that day, or you're going to do less than you probably could have done in that session because you're like, well, it's not really going to matter anyway. I'm not going to be able to get to where I want to be. It doesn't matter. And because you believe it doesn't matter, and you're going to prove that it doesn't matter. It's just a natural way that we react to those thoughts. But if you believe that you really can do it, not only are you going to focus more on the positives, on the wins that you're experiencing in your language studies, but you're also going to create more opportunities for wins. You're going to have more fun. You're going to give yourself activities that challenge you in a way that you like to be challenged, and then celebrate the progress that you've made. You're going to focus less on results and more on the journey. And so here's what I want you to do instead. I really want you to set a clear vision for your language study. So here's some questions that you can think about. What does it mean to feel ready? When you say, I'm not ready yet, why do you feel not ready? What would make you feel ready in your language studies? What skills do you need to build? What topics do you need to have the vocabulary for, or grammar that you feel like you need to master, or practice time that you need? Like, what exactly is going to help you go from where you are right now to where you want to be? Be very specific about that, because if you don't know, then ready is indefinite. Ready is forever, and you're never going to get there. And so now you might be wondering, okay, so I get this in theory, but what about the practice? I recognize now, Bront'e, that my perfectionism is keeping me stuck, but what am I supposed to do about it? And now you're overthinking. Now you're in the process of thinking so much about what you should do instead that you are stuck because you're overthinking. So in the next video, I'm going to talk you through how to stop overthinking. I'm going to give you 3 different ways on how to do that, to take more action so that you can focus less on the theory and more on the practice. Sounds good? All right. If you also struggle with perfectionism, I want you to like this video, because then we can see just how many of us are actually struggling with perfectionism in our language studies. And then in the comments, I want you to tell us, what is the one thing in your language studies that you have been trying to make perfect? Is it your accent? Is it your writing? Maybe you're trying to make sure that your writing is neat and tidy. Maybe it's about being able to understand literally anything that you read. You're like, I need to understand everything or nothing. What is the thing that you have been so fixated on as a perfectionist? Let us know. Let's start a conversation about this now that you know that it's not really suiting you, because there are some strengths to being a perfectionist, but this is not one of them. And if you want to make sure you don't miss out on the next video on overcoming your overthinking, then make sure to subscribe so you don't miss when that video drops, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.